Hi guys and welcome. I'm Victoria and we are in the kitchen today making my mom's famous apple pie. This is the best apple pie I've ever had, bar none. I don't know any of her kids that don't take one bite of this pie and instantly get transported back to our childhood Thanksgivings and Christmases. So I've kept on the tradition. I make this obviously for Thanksgiving, Christmas, but also make it for birthdays and other special occasions and sometimes just family dinners. And that's what I'm doing today. We're having a family dinner, so I'm making this for my kids. So this crust starts with 3 cups of flour and a teaspoon salt, which I've sifted into the bowl. And then we are going to add 1 1/4 cups of Crisco. I always use the Crisco bars and I put them in the refrigerator so they're good and cold. Whether you're using Crisco or butter, you want that fat to be very, very cold. It just makes a much flakier crust. And you can use butter and you can use a combination of Crisco and butter. My mom always used Crisco. It's a little old-fashioned, but I stay with it even though I'm not a huge fan of Crisco because it really does make a flaky crust that's very easy to manipulate. So I'm just going to get a 1/4 cup from this second bar of Crisco and cube that up into the flour and salt mixture. Once that's in there, I'm going to grab my pastry cutter and I'm going to start cutting the Crisco into the flour and salt mixture. And you want to keep doing that until you've got about pea-size shapes of dough forming in the bowl. And you can also use 2 knives. That's what I did before I got a pastry cutter. I always just use 2 butter knives and crisscross them back and forth and cutting into the dough. Some people even use their hands. You just crumble that with their fingers into the dough. But I'm trying to keep my hands out of this as much as possible until the end, just because I don't want to melt that Crisco. I want that dough to be very chilled. So I've got the Crisco cut into the dough, and now I'm going to make a well in the bottom of that. And in that well, I'm going to put the liquid mixture, which is 1 egg, 5 to 6 tablespoons of ice cold water. And I usually will go ahead and get a bowl of ice water ready to go so I can add that into my egg. Now I say 5 or 6 because sometimes it just depends. If you want a little heavy on the flour, you may need a little bit more, but you'll know once you start mixing this up. I'm also adding about a 1/2 tablespoon of white vinegar into the liquid mixture. And I'm going to pour about 3/4 of that liquid into the well that I've made in the dough and start to incorporate that. Once you start mixing, if you see that there's still a lot of the flour that's not getting incorporated into the dough, you can then go in and add another tablespoon at a time until you don't want a wet dough here, but you also don't want a lot of the dry mixture on the bottom of the bowl. So you're just mixing around trying to get the dough moist, and then you'll add the rest of that liquid in after that. Here I'm just going to add 1 more tablespoon of that ice water and then slowly try and work that in there. This isn't a dough that you want to overwork, but you do need for it to come together to form a dough ball. So I'm just pressing that in, trying to get that formed so that I can cut it in half and make 2 crusts. This apple pie calls for a bottom crust and a full top crust. Now I'm just using a butter knife to cut this in half, and it doesn't have to be 50-50. If I have one that's a little bit bigger than the other, I'll usually use that for the top crust. I usually fill the pie plate pretty full, so the top crust can be a little bit bigger to accommodate the amount of apples that's going to be in it. So I'm pressing these together, so I'm just forming 2 dough balls. And then I'm going to grab some saran wrap and wrap each one of these. And then also use that to press that dough down into the saran wrap once I've wrapped it, just so when I go to roll it out that those sides don't break apart as easily. I'm going to do that to both of these, and then I'm going to put them in the refrigerator to chill while I peel the apples and get everything else ready. Now you can make this. I've often made this dough, especially around the holidays when there's so much going on. I've made this dough the day before, wrapped it up and put it in the refrigerator, and then just got it out the next day, let it sit for about 30 minutes and then start working with it. It does great. You can even freeze this dough. And I mean, you want to wrap it good if you're going to put it in the freezer, but you can freeze the dough and bring it out at a later date and use it that way too, which is great if you're making a lot of desserts or a large meal. All right, so we're gonna peel the apples. I have 10 apples here. If you have a smaller pie pan, you may only need 8. I like to fill my pie pan pretty full, so I'm gonna use all 10 of these. And I'm using a combination of Granny Smith apples and McIntosh. My mom always used McIntosh, which is great. It's a good tart apple, but I also like the Granny Smith mixed in there because it's also tart, and it just gives you a little bit of a little more of a diversity of taste. If you want to make this step a little easier, they do make mechanisms that will peel the apples and will even core the apples, but I found it's almost just as quick to go ahead and do this by hand. So now that the apples are peeled, I'm just going to core them and making sure that I haven't missed any of the peel. Once I've cored them, then I'm just slicing those pieces into 3 or 4 smaller pieces each. This recipe is pretty easy. It's just, it can be a little labor intensive, making the dough and then peeling the apples and then cutting the apples and all of that. But there's nothing super technical about this. It just requires a little patience and a lot of standing on your feet. We'll go ahead and fast forward this a little bit so we're not watching me cut apples for 10 minutes. Okay, so now that the apples are done, I have my pastry sheet out, and I'm just going to sift a little bit of that flour onto it so when I roll the dough out, it doesn't stick. Okay, so I've pulled the dough out of the refrigerator and I'm unwrapping it, and we're just going to start to work that dough on the flour with the rolling pin. You do want to put a little bit of flour on the rolling pin, or, and I've done both here, sift a little on top of your dough, because your rolling pin will pick up some of that dough. And then if you don't continually get the dough off the rolling pin, it'll continue to pick more up. So you'll see a lot of times I'm scraping that dough off the rolling pin so it doesn't then pick up more. And as you're rolling this out, you really want to move that dough around. You can do a quarter turn, or you can just, as long as you're moving it around on that pastry sheet, so it's not getting stuck there, because that's going to create a problem when you go to try and transfer it from the pastry sheet onto the pie pan. So I'm just trying to roll it out so that I know it's going to fit the pie pan, and which I believe is a 9.5-inch pan. Some of the edges on this will split, and that's okay. You can push that back together. I had a small little hole in there, and I just pinched it closed. And usually that's going to do okay. Unless you have a super, super dry dough, which you want to try to avoid. That makes it really difficult to work with. Most of the time, if they split a little bit, it's fine. You can usually repair that. So I'm just using a pastry scraper to get that dough onto the rolling pin, so it makes it a little bit easier then to pick up and transfer onto the pie pan, just like that. You can move that around a little bit. Make sure that you press it down into the bottom of your pan. Got a little hole there, and I just press that closed. I'm just making sure that the crust is touching the bottom and the sides of the pan. And you can see the edges of that pie crust, they're not even, they're a little raggedy, and that's fine. I'm just taking that knife to, a lot of times people will take off the excess all the way up to the rim of the pan. I like a little extra crust around the edges of my pie. To me, that's the best part of the pie, is that crust with a little bit of the apple on it, and then with some vanilla ice cream. So I always leave a little extra. So now I'm filling the crust with the apples. Some people will go ahead and mix the sugar in with the apples in the bowl. You can do that and it works fine. I've always just put the apples into the crust and then added the sugar after. I had a liqueur left on that one, so I'm just cutting that out. So this recipe does call for a full cup of sugar. If I'm making a smaller pie, I sometimes just do about 3/4 of a cup, but my mom's recipe always called for a cup, and that's fine. It's just for a smaller pie. I like to maintain a little bit of the tartness of the apples, but that's personal preference. So here I'm using a full cup of sugar. All right, now we're adding cinnamon, and I don't have an exact amount. I usually will just give it a good sprinkle over the top of it. If I had to guess, I would say probably that's maybe a half a tablespoon. But you do want to give the whole top a good sprinkle. All right, now we're coming in with nutmeg, and I don't do as much nutmeg. I do probably about half as much nutmeg as I do cinnamon. I think nutmeg is a really important ingredient. It gives that something extra that a lot of apple pies don't have, and people do notice it. So for just a little bit extra richness, I'm going in and I've quartered a stick of butter, and I'm just putting 5 or 6 little pats of butter along the top of the pie. And then the last thing that goes on before the top crust is a sprinkle of flour, and that's just going to help thicken up some of those juices. And now it's time to get out the top crust. Just scraping off any pieces of pastry that was left on from the bottom crust and adding more flour. So we're going to work this top crust the exact same way we did for the bottom crust. I'm just pressing it in there, making sure the edges are going to hold together when I start to roll this out. Putting a little bit of flour on the rolling pin, and then going in and adding a little extra to the top of the crust. This one you do need to make sure that you make it large enough that's going to not only go around the circumference of the pie pan, but also cover the mound of apples that you now have in the pie pan. So you're going to roll a few times, and then you want to turn and keep that going so your crust doesn't stick. As it gets a little bit thinner, I roll a little bit less just because it's more apt to tear. And I am a little more particular about the top crust. I don't want that tearing because it's not as easy to repair and still look nice. Whereas the bottom crust, you're not going to see any of that anyway, so it's not as big of a deal. All right, we're going to do this the same way. We're going to roll it onto the rolling pin, and then lay it over top of the apples. And we have a little crease there, which is fine. This doesn't have to be perfect. So I'm just cutting off the extras, some of the ones that were hanging there, but also I want the crust around the pie to be fairly even, so I don't want one side to have a lot more crust than another. I think presentation is important, but taste is even more important. And I'm just tucking that top layer underneath the bottom layer and then pushing it onto the rim of the pie pan. So now I'm just crimping the edges. You can use a fork for this. It works fine. I've done both. Most of the time, I will just use the index finger and thumb of one hand to hold the crust while I press down in between those two fingers with the thumb of my other hand. Super easy, and it always looks nice. This is going to help seal the pie so all of the juices aren't coming out around the edges of the crust. And it just makes it look better. You can see there I have a tiny little hole in the crust, which is fine because it's vents anyway. And I'll make some with a fork, but a tiny little hole like that is not going to matter. So I'm putting a little bit of whole milk on top of the crust, and I've used brushes for this, but I've noticed that it sometimes will leave brush strokes in the crust. I just don't like the way that it looks, so I'm using my hands. I know a lot of people use egg whites and other things, but I've always just used milk, and it does a good job. And you want to use a light touch with this. You don't want to be pressing down. You just want a little bit of that milk left on the ridges around the pie and then on the top of the pie crust. And finally, I am just giving the pie some vent holes with a fork, and I've just put the letter A on top for apple. I'm putting that into a 425-degree oven for 15 minutes. After that, I reduced the oven to 375 degrees and baked for 40 minutes. I did put some foil on the last 20 minutes just to keep it from getting too brown. So there you go, beautiful apple pie that tastes wonderful. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I hope you'll consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel. Thanks for joining me today. I hope to see you next time.